Good morning, everybody. I'm Anastasia Brown. I'm the Director of Resettlement Services for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I am going to try to explain the Central American Minors CAM resettlement program in country for the U.S. refugee program. I just want to ask everyone in the room, who's started their taxes? Okay. I don't know about you, but I find that an incredibly complicated process. And that is something that, is an incredibly complicated process that we as English speakers, et cetera, go through. I often say that that's got nothing on the refugee resettlement process. It's really quite a strange, complicated process for those of us to understand, let alone somebody actually trying to go through this process. So let's all keep that in mind as we go forward. Next slide, please. We've talked about the importance of collaboration, and we're going to come back to talking a little bit about this at the end, hopefully, of my presentation. But this is not going to be the sole solution. None of us believe that this is the sole solution for the challenges faced by these children. And in actuality, we all know we're probably not reaching the most vulnerable with this program. So let's keep that in mind. But we do want to see this be successful for many reasons. And one is the very important reason that we want to establish that, in fact, this is a refugee population. And if we can see children successfully come through this program as refugees, we can continue to change the dialogue about these children. So information, collaboration between resettlement offices, immigration, legal services, immigrant rights groups, it's really essential to make this work. And one of the very important reasons is one raised by Shana earlier, that we need to have this information flow through to the people who it could help. The refugee resettlement offices, as you all saw a moment ago, are not dealing primarily with this population. So this is not necessarily a population that already trusts or knows the local refugee resettlement office. We really need to build some important information flow here. And as we seek to implement this program, there are people who perhaps could benefit from both programs, such as the Deferred Action program, the one on hold right now, of the administration's executive action, but there are possibilities that we could build into exchange of information. Next slide, please. So how could we do this? And we're going to come back to this again, but as I'm going through my presentation, please think about some of these things. How could you build this information into the existing Know Your Rights presentations? If you're already working with unaccompanied children, are there parents and children that have other children who are not yet left the country? And if you're working with Central American communities, how can we help be sure that the materials can be disseminated to the communities appropriately? So what is the program? Next slide, please. You all can be very grateful that you don't actually have to fill out this form. This form, the DS7699, is the Affidavit of Relationship that was created for minors who are nationals of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and have a parent in legal status in the United States. However, the child must still be in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The administration has described this as a safe, legal, orderly option, and we all agree and support that, but don't want to make sure, we don't want to say this is the only option. It's estimated that maybe 250 children this year may benefit from this, although there isn't an actual ceiling on the number of children. It's within that ceiling that Stacy put out for us of the 4,000 Latin American. However, the administration always has the ability to move from the unallocated reserve to, if there were a sudden tremendous amount of children eligible for this, and also from other areas if they're not meeting their targets. There is no fee for this program, and we want to be sure that we make sure everybody understands that. There are fees associated with this program, but there are no fees for actually filing, and I'll get into that in a little bit further. So beware of scams is one of the big points we want to be sure everyone understands. And this program launched late in the year. So it launched in December, which is still in the first quarter of the federal fiscal year, but the process takes a long time. So we're not actually seeing the number of applications that we hoped we could be seeing at this point. I have on this slide that there were less than 25. I think the number has actually gone up since this was put in place, which is good, but it's still not where we would like to see it. And I've been asked, what is the time frame? What is the time frame for this process? Well, we don't really know yet, because no child has successfully gone all the way through this process. But I will say that the refugee resettlement process in general is a long process. And there are some complicated pieces of this which might make it even longer. So if you looked around the world, actually, from the time a case is received by the U.S. government as a potential refugee case to the time it arrives, the number of days could be a year or more before a refugee actually arrives in the United States. And in some areas, such as Africa, it can be more than 3 years. How does it work? So how does the system work? A U.S.-based parent in current lawful presence has to file with a local refugee resettlement office this form, the application form DS7699. Now, this form is long, and it asks a lot of questions, and I'm being told by some of my local offices that it can take up to 3 hours or more to go through this form. So just be aware of that. That form, once it's filed, will then be sent through a system in the U.S., refugee system, and vetted, and if it appears eligible, will be sent to the IOM office. They are the Refugee Support Center for Latin America. They'll screen it. They'll call a child in and do a pre-screening, and if everything appears to look correct, they will then ask for DNA testing. So this is an important piece of this. This DNA test has to affirm the relationship, and then if it does, the USCIS office will schedule a refugee interview, and if relevant, there can be add-on derivatives. Now, derivatives being derivative, meaning you have status from the refugee, who's the principal applicant would only be an unmarried son or daughter. So we are now talking about a child of a child, and not a parent. However, they can add on parents to the case with some caveats, and we'll get to that later. There will be background checks, there will be medical exams, there will be cultural orientation, and if you are granted refugee status, there will be a travel loan to get to the U.S. The U.S. refugee process makes sure that any excludabilities are screened for. So the same excludabilities that you would have for immigrants also apply in refugees. However, there are some waivers that aren't available for immigrants. So, next slide. Who is the anchor parent? The anchor parent must be living in the U.S. with legal status. It does include status which is not typically looked at in other refugee programs. So you can be an LPR, you can be in temporary protective status, you can be a DACA recipient, deferred action, parole, deferred enforced departure, or even withholding for removal. However, you'll note you cannot be a U.S. citizen, you cannot be, a parent cannot be an asylee, and cannot have entered the country in refugee status, because they all have a different process that they could be filing for. The parent has to be 18 years of old or older, and the parent does not need to be a native of Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador. So if you have somebody who has a stepchild who is in fact, they can file. So you could have a parent who was from Nicaragua, for instance, just as an example. If an anchor parent is a recipient of parole or deferred action, this is important, the original grant has to have been for 1 year or more. There is going to be a status check in this whole process, and that individual who's the parent still has to be in legal status when that child arrives. So the original grant must have been for 1 year or more because they think that process is going to take more than a year. And if the parent is now going through a renewal, that process has to be finalized before that child arrives. Who is the child? The child has to have been born in Honduras, El Salvador, or Guatemala. The relationship is the same for your immigration categories. It must be a biological child, a stepchild, or an adopted child, a legal adoption, not an informal adoption. There isn't my slide just got very small there. Okay. There is not a minimum age requirement. So the child doesn't have to be over 6, etc. But they have to be unmarried. And here's an interesting difference. They have to be under the age of 21. So in the ORR, children who are arriving here, that age cutoff is 18 to be eligible for the unaccompanied minor program. In our refugee context, the child is 21 or younger. And they have to be unmarried, and they still have to be unmarried when they enter the United States, which is an interesting question in refugee law because all of this is to get access to the interview. Once you've established access to the interview, you have to prove your refugee claim. Once you've proven yourself to be a refugee, you could wonder whether your marriage has any impact on that, but that would have to have taken place after the initial interview. So children must meet the minimal standards for a refugee determination. So if you have a child who's 2 years old, that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, right? And they have to undergo a refugee interview. If a child is unable to go through a refugee interview on their own, they have to be accompanied by a parent or a trusted adult. So if you've got a child who doesn't have a parent with them, they can determine that this may not be a legal guardian, but they're a trusted adult and they can come to the interview with them. That doesn't mean they're undergoing a refugee determination. So let's talk a little bit about derivatives of the child. The derivative of the child can be included if they're unmarried and under 21 years old. And they derive status from the qualifying child, the principal applicant. They don't have to go through an independent interview to establish a persecution claim. They do have to establish the relationship. On a case-by-case basis, the legal parent of the child can also qualify. But this is interesting. They have to live in the same household. So if you have a child who's been displaced and can't be with their parent, perhaps that child, that cannot apply. They have to be part of that same economic unit. And they have to maintain a documented marriage to the anchor parent. Okay, so they can't just be the mother of the child who's not married to the anchor parent here. The parent does not have to be born in Guatemala, El Salvador, or Honduras, but they need to be living there now. And since the parent can't derive status, the parent has to come up with their own refugee claim. Now, this is not beyond expectation. Quite often the family is being targeted and the parent would also have a refugee claim. But it is important to know that what's happening to my child is not the claim that a parent can make. So what are the requirements when filing this? It has to be completed by a resettlement agency. There are going to be current photos. They require documentation of that lawful status. And there may be other relevant documentation. Now, they don't necessarily spell this out. So here is where we really need to think of what is relevant documentation. That could be, for instance, the date and the marriage claim. The marriage documentation, because if you're claiming a stepchild relationship, the marriage has to have taken place before the child turns, so you have to actually have that. The resettlement agencies are going to be providing more details when the appointment is made and going through a one-on-one interview with the family. But this is the most we know at any time, that they should come with their documentation to that interview. DNA testing, as I said, is going to be required. It is required now in all of the family reunification programs of the U.S. Refugee Program. This has to establish the biological child. So obviously a stepchild doesn't have to go through DNA testing, or an adopted child doesn't have to go through DNA testing. It has to be done through the Association of American Blood Banks, and there is a process that has to be followed. The parent has to pay up front, and this can be quite burdensome for some of our populations. So there will be at least probably $650. The labs differ in the amount of money that they charge. And if it is positively established that this is the child of this anchor parent, then they will be reimbursed. Now this is important. This doesn't mean that the refugee status has to have been established. It just means that the relationship is established. So you could ultimately have an instance where your biological claim was established, they're reimbursing $650. That doesn't mean you've passed the refugee interview, and the parent needs to understand that. And then if a refugee is denied, they may want to submit a request for review through a local refugee resettlement office. And this has to happen within certain set time periods, and it must actually address the reason for rejection, which can sometimes be difficult to understand, because sometimes it's very boilerplate language why somebody was rejected for credibility, and you don't know what it was that the officer found to be not credible. Here is a very short map of the process. There's actually about 22 steps between each one of these. But one thing that doesn't appear on this, and I want to stress for everybody, is that there is a check which USCIS conducts called RAVU, Refugee Access Verification. And that check looks at the information known about the anchor. So if the anchor has, for instance, claimed a certain status, that is going to be verified by them, not just the document presented, but also if there was some reason that the anchor filled out information such as they were married to somebody completely different, that would be something that would be looked at in this process as well. So just quickly, the process is that the minors, this form is filled out. We send it through the Refugee Processing Center. The Refugee Processing Center sends it to the RSC, IOM. They call the child and whatever family members apply into a pre-screening. After the pre-screening, if this DNA testing is established, if the RAVU document checks look good, then they're called in for an interview with a USCIS officer. There they have to actually establish their refugee claim. If their refugee claim is established, a request, they will be sent for a medical exam. If the medical exam shows no excludabilities, they will be scheduled for departure after a local resettlement office, a national office through its local has produced sponsorship agreement for this, and then they will arrive in the United States. There are all kinds of things that expire in this process, including medical exams. So if your security check has taken a long time to go through, you may in fact then have a medical exam that's expired. So you can take longer than just a quick process. However, this is an interesting piece. If you are denied refugee status, there is an option in this program to be granted parole. And USCIS will, in fact, at the time of the refugee interview, if you have been denied, ask you if you want to be considered for parole. Now, parole, the applicant will need to have the anchor in the United States file an affidavit of support. That affidavit of support is going to have to show that they can, in fact, support the child and the accompanying family members. They will have to pay for their own medical clearances, And they have to make their own travel arrangements, but the arrangements have to be through a process that USCIS approves of. So let's go for a moment to this slide, which is what are the differences then between refugee status and parole status. So a refugee will not have to pay for their medical exam. They will get a travel loan, so their travel will be arranged. They will receive that resettlement assistance that was described in the earlier piece. They're authorized immediately to work. The children attend school. They must adjust after 1 year. They can include unmarried children as derivatives, and they can petition for others once they're in the United States. They're eligible to apply for citizenship after 5 years. But if you've come in as a parole, you have to pay up front. You have no resettlement assistance. You have to apply for a work authorization. You must request advance parole if you want to leave. You cannot apply for other people to come. Your children, of course, can attend school. This is temporary, so it has to be reapplied for. And there is no permanent immigration status or pathway in this parole status. They need a sponsor. And they are not eligible for most public benefits and will definitely be in need of legal services. I think this is an important thing to raise because we are very likely going to have families in mixed status. So you may have a situation where a child gets the refugee status, but the parent does not. However, they've granted them parole. That is going to be very confusing for families, and it's going to be very important that we work together to make sure people understand. So some benefits of parole, they are, of course, eligible for emergency Medicaid, medical treatment. They are eligible for immunizations, school breakfasts, the WIC program, short-term non-cash programs, in-kind services, as long as income qualifications aren't impacted. So there are very good reasons that somebody should come in as a parolee, particularly if there's a threat or a humanitarian, you don't want to leave the mother alone. However, remember that they are in a much different status from the person who entered as a refugee. The next slide, warning on fraud. So it is important that the anchor knows that their documents are going to be checked, that their relationship is going to be checked, and that in fact if they are misrepresenting the situation, they could be in trouble with their own immigration status. So we want to be sure that this is known to everybody who's coming forward to apply. And this is something that the resettlement agencies are required to tell people, but also when you are working with a family, you want to be sure they understand this as well. And that brings us to discussion, which I hope will be the major portion of this. So I am interested in hearing what you are hearing from people about the in-country processing program. If there are people already qualifying, one of the questions Shana, who had to leave, was asking is, why aren't people filing? And what are people worried about? What are the obstacles? How can we get the word out? Anything that you feel we need to really embrace and work together on in this. So I'm actually going to ask you now to answer some of these questions for me.
Hi, I'm Christina Dos Santos. I work at Ayuda in our Virginia office. My experience in December, I referred some folks, some of my clients who I thought might be eligible to some of our local agencies. And at that time, it didn't seem that the program had really been rolled out yet. Mm-hmm. And I had clients trying to reach them and not really getting a lot of information, probably because it wasn't quite ready yet. So I know it's been several months since then. My question is whether the local resettlement agencies have got their systems set up and are ready to receive referrals from direct legal service providers.
It's a great question. The answer is complicated. Everybody has been trained, but I think you all saw that map of where are children being released. If you look at that, some of those sites are very small resettlement sites. So, number one, I know, for example, in one of the areas of Long Island, it doesn't see a lot of refugees. Now they've got 100 people trying to fill out a form that takes 3 hours to fill out. So there is a strain. There's definitely a strain. And another issue is language translation. So sometimes, as we said, the Refugee Resettlement Office is working with Somalis, Iraqis, Burmese, and they don't necessarily have the Spanish, or let's face it, the Guatemalans don't speak Spanish. So that is a very important weakness. Everybody's been trained, and hopefully people are being given an appointment. And I hate to think of that appointment being delayed way down the line, but I do know that it has happened. Kitty.
Hi, Anastasia. Oh. Hi, I'm Kitty Picker, and I work for the International Rescue Committee, which is one of the 9 national voluntary resettlement agencies. And I oversee the immigration legal service provision through our network of 24 resettlement offices nationwide. So I just wanted to piggyback on a few of the things Anastasia said. That first of all, yeah, our office is getting referrals. Our offices, some of our resettlement offices in certain locations, are getting referrals from other refugee resettlement agency affiliate offices who simply lack the capacity to, complete the CAM AORs. So, not every affiliate office of every resettlement agency in every location is necessarily going to be able to assist an individual with the CAM AOR. So it's worthwhile for individuals who are interested in filing, or for those of you in communities where you're working with people who might, to familiarize yourselves with all the affiliate offices, or if there are more than one, even if it isn't the closest one to where you are, if there's another one, a half an hour away or an hour away, it might be worth shopping around.
And I'll just say that the link that shows all of the resettlement offices is available in your materials. But if for some reason you are finding that there's nobody around, let one of the national offices know.
Right.
And there is the possibility that we can somehow make sure that that case gets filed.
Right.
I just want to echo what Kitty is saying, because that's why I showed you the video of Mock. So Mock's a great guy, great case manager, and you saw what he was doing that particular day. So if a parent presents at that office door and wants to work on their AOR, number one, Mock does not speak Spanish or any languages from Guatemala. And number two, while Mock has been trained and in his career has completed AORs on many occasions, he does not have the understanding of the conditions in Central America, and he is not able to give this family any advice, as Anastasia pointed out, about how people are going to be in different situations. This child, that parent, this cousin, all, and that's not his role, nor is he able to give that advice. So in fact, for our network, USCRI, we have asked that the case managers or the structure internally also include a screen by an immigration attorney, or at a minimum a BIA rep, because we know that that's beyond the scope of what the case managers can do. And they literally, if you went to the Des Moines office, that's the guy who would help do the form.
So again, that's an interesting and wonderful possibility. The form itself has to be filed by a resettlement agency. Some of the resettlement agencies also have within their own, on the local level, within their own structure, BIA accredited reps, so they can assist in this process. One of the stresses is this issue of language, and while the immigration side might have been dealing with the languages, the refugee resettlement side was not. So building that bridge, even in a local office, can be important.
Right, and I also just wanted to point out that in a lot of refugee resettlement offices, as Anastasia points out, many, if not most, resettlement offices have at least one person on staff who's been accredited at least partially accredited by the Board of Immigration Appeals to provide legal representation on a limited basis to our primarily to our refugee clients. There's a big difference, as a lot of you who are, attorneys or practice, the 99% of the rest of immigration law. There's a big difference between, doing a green card application for a refugee or a family reunification petition for a refugee, and then, many of the other types of services that typically this population, which are, individuals who've come here from Central America, have, needed in the past. So there is also a challenge for us and for our staff in assessing eligibility among people who want to, file this form on behalf of their relatives, because, as Anastasia pointed out in her presentation, it's a very different population, and the eligibility criteria are vastly different from anything we've ever seen before in the refugee resettlement context. That is, we're being asked to assist people with temporary protected status, people with parole, people who have deferred action, not just the deferred action for childhood arrivals, but people who may have received deferred action because, through a conditional U visa grant or VAWA. And these are not cases that we are familiar with. And, some of the documentation issues are also challenging for us. So, to those of you attorneys among you, you can be a huge resource for us in terms of, vetting individuals who, meet the eligibility criteria, in helping, to explain that to our staff who are tasked with completing these CAM AORs. Anyway.
So, in the back there. No.
I think we're waiting here.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, my name is Natalia. I work at Arnold & Porter, a law firm. I have a little question. I have not very clear whether for the parent who's in the U.S., is it enough for the parent to be resident of the United States?
No.
Or does he have to be national of the United States?
No.
Or?
Actually, the parent has to have been has to have legal status in the United States, but does not have to be a national of the United States.
So whatever other status, he doesn't need to achieve the higher...
No.
Okay.
Actually, if he's a citizen, he's not eligible.
Okay. Yeah.
My name is Paula Fitzgerald. I work at Ayuda in our Virginia office. And I think just echoing what Christina had said about not knowing when they're doing the rollout, I think one of the issues that's probably leading to less referrals being made than what would otherwise is that we don't know. We don't know anyone, I think, who works in the refugee resettlement agencies. So I think people coming together, the actual people in the different localities, so that you can email them and ask, how long would it take if I did refer a client and I called them, how long would it take for them to get in? What if we actually had someone that might be able to help them, or a social worker we have that might be able to interpret? Or do they have Spanish-speaking people? We don't know. So I'm not sure how much capacity the refugee resettlement agencies have for outreach, but if they did have some for targeted outreach, because we have networks of groups that work with children's legal issues, immigration legal issues, stuff like that, just a group of us being able to meet some of the people who actually work in these agencies, so we have those contacts in place and we can make more, I guess, directed and informed referrals.
So here's what I'm going to suggest on that, and I think that's really what we're trying to make sure happens. One is introduce yourself. You'll have the actual contact information there. So make the outreach and introduce yourself and say, I have the ability to make this. If you are getting some sort of a, let the national office know, okay? And then we can see if there are things we can do. I do want to clarify that there is no funding for these local offices to actually be doing this work. The way the refugee resettlement system works, you're actually reimbursed for refugees arriving, and there's very little funding available to do this new incredible amount of work they've been asked to take on. So.
Great. I just wanted to add to that, both Paula and Christina, I think those are really good points. And Kids in Need of Defense, we have some funding to help support local outreach between immigration legal service providers and refugee resettlement agencies. And we're in particular working with the International Rescue Committee and collaborating with others through the RCUSA network. So I think one of our goals is to pilot an outreach event at the local level where we would actually ask resettlement agencies to come to an event like this, arrange it around a brown bag, something a little more informal, where you can actually meet each other and figure out where those gaps are, because I think that might help facilitate that. We don't have funding to go all over the place, but if we can target certain communities, I think that would be a first step to pilot that type of outreach, and maybe have it at Ayuda. Not volunteering you. We can always look for another space. Okay, great. So I think this is like a good opportunity to pilot that idea and really try to figure out those gaps at each location. They might be different. Let's say in Florida, they might have more access to Indigenous interpreters than here. So just figuring out where the gaps are at each locale, I think would be a great suggestion by you all. Thank you.
We have two questions here and then one in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Andrea Rodriguez from the Central American Resource Center, Carecen, in D.C. And one of the challenges was to actually identify resettlement agencies that served folks in D.C. because the list doesn't have anyone for D.C. And so, we had to hunt around and make a few phone calls and even reach out to Ayuda, like, what were your leads? Okay, this is what we got. And, ask questions on the listserv. We've had about 10 people so far in our organization. We've kept track of the numbers that have asked about it, and that's without us doing any outreach whatsoever. But definitely the outreach could be better, and especially within the local media. But I think particularly with Central Americans, in the immigration realm, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of confusion, within the immigration community and with us. But for Central Americans in particular, it's a lot more because you have not only the Central American minor surge that came in, and you have families that are dealing with their minors in proceedings. You have TPS renewal that just finished now, and even folks, not having that clear whether or not, they can adjust under TPS, or, newly arrived folks wondering if they're eligible for TPS and making that clear. You have executive action and what's going on, and the injunction, and you have the possibilities of immigration reform, and then you have the in-country process for Central American minors. So all that gets so confused, and I think it's important that when outreach is done to distinguish it from everything else that's going on, because there's confusion and it gets lost, and you don't know what program is connected to what. But we're trying to put the message out clearly. But yeah, definitely working with the local media, and also the suggestions, and scheduling a time where the local organizations can, legal service organizations can meet with the refugee resettlement agencies and get to know each other, I think is essential.
So thank you for that. There's actually two things I'd like to mention. One is that although an office is listed in, let's say in DC, we have Arlington, Virginia, Springfield, it doesn't mean that they don't serve people in other areas. So it's really who's closest is the issue. And it's not necessarily the city. If you're not living in that city, you can't file there. You can file even if you're not living there with an office somewhere around. And the other is, yes, it's very confusing. And one thing that we hope is that even though you may be doing outreach for another issue, if somebody in that outreach session actually may have a child qualifying for this, they at least get information handed out to them in some way that would then put them in connection with something else. Because people could be eligible for various things. The same person may be eligible for several different things.
Hi, my name is Jenny Gachaya, and I'm with Catholic Charities of Washington. At Catholic Charities of Washington, we provide LOPC services, Legal Orientation Program for Custodians of Unaccompanied Minors, through a contract with DOJ, EOIR. And we have been doing this for about 4 years now. I remember that when the program was first announced, I was unaware for a couple of weeks. And I had a custodian ask me that during a presentation, and I said, I don't know, I have to find out. And then I was able to after I educated myself, I was able to get back to the custodian. But we have since had a lot of questions during our in-group presentations. I mean, our presentations, we largely serve custodians of children, obviously from Central America. Our group presentations could go from anywhere from 15 custodians to 40, 50. And so we have since incorporated a little bit about the program during our presentations. However, we have a lot of information to cover, and we make the information available. We have a flyer where people can come, and if they're interested, we explain a little bit. Obviously, we have to focus on forms of relief and attending court and all that. So, I feel that on other occasions when people come to our offices, we're so overwhelmed. We have a line of 40, 50 people trying to get assistance with so many cases that someone comes, or 2 or 3 people are trying to get information about this program, that we unfortunately don't have the resources to attend to their needs right there and then. So we just give them a list. I mean, some people may have a hard time getting around the city, not knowing how to read, not even in Spanish. So I guess that using those settings, maybe I know your resources are limited, but I don't know if you have volunteers out there that can come. For example, during one of our intakes in Silver Spring, this is our busiest office, to just have somebody there that can answer those questions and do a little bit of outreach. It's just an idea if there is extra funding for that.
So again, the funding itself, probably not, but that doesn't mean we can't get people to particular places. So actually sharing those schedules of when those sessions are happening could be helpful. What we don't want to do is derail your session that you're having on some other issue into this. So we want to be sure that we are sharing the information, but not necessarily then taking over your conversation about the court process, for instance.
I'm Reverend Sharon Stanley Ray, and I work as Director for Refugee and Immigration Ministries with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And I work here in D.C. now, but many years in a previous life was in the Central Valley of California. So thinking, for example, of the enormity of the task of sharing information. I know Fresno, California, is one example, is located some real distance from most resettlement agencies at this point. It wasn't true years ago, but now. So I'm wondering about both a review of the simplest resources that could be shared and that we should all leave from today's session, making sure that we share with whoever our contacts are. And also I'm wondering if there's been planning for some particular intentional webinars or other sessions that would be targeted especially towards community-based agencies that are working in significant ways and have been for decades with Hispanic, Latino, Latin American serving communities.
So I think that's a wonderful takeaway is, could there be some process that we all look at the materials we have and make sure that in fact they are usable by everybody? The other is this map of resettlement offices and where they are now could shift. Because if in fact there is a need and we see suddenly that you're going to have 500 children arriving in an area, that would be a reason that Department of State would look at potentially opening new resettlement offices. So we could see a shift in several years of where the local offices are based on the need. I don't know if that addressed part of that question, but that is definitely something we're looking at, comparing where the local offices are with where we would be seeing the need to do outreach and service.
My name is Anna Green. I'm with the IRC, one of the resettlement agencies. I wanted to bring us a little bit back to the issue of the low numbers. So far, as of end of February, there were 160-some AORs filed involving about 187 people. I think one of our concerns, because we do want to use this program to demonstrate that there is a refugee situation in the region, but at the same time, the eligibility requirements are very narrowly drawn. Not only because you have to have legal status, but because you have to be below 21. So, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country from these 3 countries, or at least from 2 of them, that have TPS. But the likelihood that someone's child who left, Honduras after Hurricane Mitch is still under 21 is low. Now, resettlement agencies aren't in the Central American communities, and we really need your community to help us understand why the number is low. So if only 1 out of every 10 Central Americans that you talk to about this program actually qualify because they're undocumented or because their child is over 21, that information is very valuable to us, because as we advocate with the government on this program, both to keep the doors to asylum open, so this isn't used as a pretext to reduce asylum space, but also as we talk to the government about the need to expand the eligibility criteria so that we meet more children's needs, we really need you in that analysis. We simply don't have the capacity to do that analysis ourselves.
And I'll just add to that, I know working with many of the children who are released to family, it's sometimes, I'm going to say quite often, not the parent who has the legal status in the U.S. It could be an uncle, it could be a brother. So that is definitely something that we want to raise and advocate for changes in the program in the future.
This is Christy Turner with Kids in Need of Defense, DC office. And I was just wondering what people's thoughts are on the possible role of attorneys or child advocates at the interview stage, and kind of what are people thinking about in terms of facilitating, counseling the child before they get to the interview abroad? So
in the U.S. refugee process, there isn't an ability for legal representation in the interview. So that is definitely an issue. However, counseling beforehand could definitely be something we try to build in.
Leslie again from UNHCR. In hearing, this sounds like so many good points of collaboration, and I just wanted to put 2 ideas, or one concept out and then an idea out. The first one is that, as service providers in different forms, everything from Codison to AYUDA to the resettlement agencies to the legal representation, there was a point that Arya made earlier in terms of compared to this time last year, the numbers are down. But we have to remember that the surge wasn't just last year. It's been building for the last 4, 5. And to put this in perspective, the numbers for the first 4 years of fiscal year 2015 are still more than the total annual number of 2008, 2009, 2010. And in 2 months, we'll be able to say combined. Yeah? So the numbers are still outrageously high. They're just not as outrageously high as they were this time last year. And so everyone is really, being taxed in terms of capacity. But what I did hear, and here's the idea I just wanted to put forward. So it's great that people have resources to bring, folks together. Because maybe in the 2 steps, one is identifying, getting out to the community and getting the word out. But we're also sitting in a room full of experts who know how to put naturalization clinics and workshops together, no pressure, to, clinic and the ALA folks, to be able to do that. And so while it has to be filed by the resettlement agency, there's so much opportunity for collaboration. And if, getting the word out to the community and saying, on this Saturday in your local church or your local community center, we'll bring out these volunteers to help fill out the paperwork, to do the screenings, and then the resettlement agencies can file them. Anyway, you all know how to do this en masse much better than me personally. So I just wanted to put that thought out there because I see it moving in that direction, especially since there's local DC folks here. Hopefully DC can even be a model, to replicate in other regions.
Hi, I'm Elena. I work at Human Rights First on our representation program for children and minors, which is pretty much exclusively from Central America. So I had a couple questions actually based on what we've been talking about. So I'm wondering if any of the local resettlement agencies, especially like SWRC, can provide a bit more information about applications they've seen. Are people being able to get appointments quickly? Are you able to access interpreters for these services, that kind of thing? Because I know we've had hesitations about referring clients because I think other people, especially from Ayuda, have pointed out that we just don't have the established relationships yet, and we're a bit worried about referring clients out without any idea of sort of what they'll get on the receiving end. And I also had a question slightly different from what we've been talking about, but in the actual processing, my colleagues had asked me to ask about the different steps such as pre-screening and the asylum interview during the process. Who exactly will be conducting that, and have those people received the proper training to identify these claims properly, since they probably haven't worked with these populations extensively in the past?
So let me answer that question first, which has to do with the process. The refugee RSC, the IOM, their job is just really to look at the paperwork and make sure everything is in order, collect the initial claim, document the family members, etc. So we have asked that they all receive training on child-friendly interviewing, etc., but I can't guarantee you that at this point has happened. We know that is something that we continue to ask about. The interviewing officer, though, will be a Refugee Corps, USCIS Refugee Corps officer. So they actually, of course, do have the training on the needs, on the refugee claim, and also on interviewing children. But we're also trying to make sure that they, as they collect their country condition information, actually have the right material to take from. So they're not only looking at perhaps government reports, but also NGO reports, etc.
And sorry, quick follow-up question on that. I know that the child has to go in person for this interview. Do you have any sense of like how far these children may have to travel? Sorry. Do you have any sense of where these interviews are taking place? Like, are children having to travel many, many hours to get to an interview site?
So I will say that the RSC's offices are in El Salvador and Honduras, most likely going to be in the capitals. However, in Guatemala, they are acknowledging the fact that, in fact, most of the children are in the very rural areas. So they haven't yet told us where they will be doing the interviews. Anna, did you have any update on that?
El Salvador, as you all know, is much smaller than the other two countries. I was speaking with one of the staff members of the RSC, the International Organization for Migration, just yesterday, and she was mentioning that a child who recently had to come in for their first interview had to travel 9 hours in El Salvador. So imagine if you're in the highlands of Guatemala, or you're in, a dangerous location in Honduras, and you have to get to Tegucigalpa. So that is a concern, and a child typically has to go to the capital 4 times before they travel. If they're accepted, maybe only 3 if they're not accepted. So that's a big concern, and it's something that we have on our very, very long list of advocacy points and points of raising with PRM as the program unfolds.
And just to say on that, yes, at least a pre-screening, a screening with the USCIS officer, a medical exam, all of those are going to require the child to go back and forth. DNA testing, photographs, etc.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lazaro Zamora from the Bipartisan Policy Center's Immigration Task Force. And I guess my question, I think we started getting to that, is more about the numbers. I think as Leslie alluded to, I think in the past 4 months, there's already been upwards of like 12,000 apprehensions. And this program falls under their Latin American designation, which is 4,000, and even a little bit smaller number within that, because they share it with Cuban refugees as well. So is there an active plan to kind of lobby for a higher number if this program is successful in FY 2015 for the designation in FY 2016? Or is the hope really just to have this program in the Latin American countries be, well, there's a hope of getting this program, so maybe that'll stem some of the flow, which so far it hasn't happened, but clearly it's in its early stages, so maybe people don't know about it yet.
So, yes, it is within the Latin American ceiling. There isn't a specific number within that Latin American ceiling saying only 250 children will come in. It's what was anticipated might come in the year. Our advocacy in general has to do with increasing the presidential determination. I think, as was noted, it hasn't really significantly increased in many, many years. And the need, if we look at this on top of Syrians, on top of Iraqis continuing, the need of the refugee program is much bigger. So this can be one of the talking points to increasing the presidential determination, particularly if we see a swell of people filing being greater than those who actually have the ability to arrive because of some number problem. But that would be a good problem to have.
I have just kind of a comment about why I think the numbers are pretty low, and this kind of goes to your comment, Anna. I think that the largest source of potential anchor parents now are TPS holders, and by definition, those TPS holders have to have arrived in the United States by 1998 or early 2001 for Honduras and El Salvador. So that puts those kids at the age of 13, 14, 15. And I think while this would have been, we probably would have seen larger numbers in this program if it had been in place like 3 or 4 years ago, because I think those are the kids that have kind of maybe already made their way here if they were facing danger and if they did have a parent to reunite with. But at this point, the eligible kids remaining who have TPS parents here is probably relatively small. Obviously, if we have DAPA in place, that number is going to be, much, much larger. But that's just kind of my 2 cents from having worked previously with a population of primarily TPS holders and Central Americans.
I absolutely agree with the point that Christy just made, and just kind of identifying within my own caseload the opportunities that might exist for folks who might be eligible for this program. I think probably one of the key areas will be people with deferred action. I know that already got mentioned, but given the cap and the increasing number of petitions being filed, I have a lot of clients who have filed for visas who are absolutely dismayed at the thought of having to wait years before they can consular process their children, and who are very concerned for the safety of their children. So I think that is a big opportunity area, but it's still not going to be huge numbers. And then the other area that I would identify within my own caseload is folks from Central America who have withholding of removal and who haven't been able to bring their kids. I have a few people who may be very excited at this opportunity who are in that situation.
Great. Other questions? Leslie.
So zooming out a little bit, I think the challenge is identifying people, not so much that qualify in this small Plinko board of eligibility, which is more generous, I guess, than we had thought at the beginning of the conversation, but it's, do we know of people here in the United States who have family members in these countries that fear persecution, fear for their lives? That's the question. And quantifying that is really important. And then saying, can they qualify for this particular program? If yes, put them through. If no, let's make sure, though, to capture that information, because it actually just highlights why this narrow little window isn't an appropriate response, especially when this narrow little window, if there aren't people applying for it, they're going to say, well, it is enforcement. It is just an economic migration issue. We gave them an opportunity. If you really are a refugee, then come forward in country. And look, small numbers. So therefore, there really aren't refugees, and that's why our enforcement tactics, are appropriate, because it's not a refugee situation. So I just wanted, I think this was said, but just to be even more direct, is as community and there's collaboration at the local level, it's to identify everyone, family members who fear for their family members, whether they were here before or after, Hurricane Mitch. It's like to identify all of them and quantify that, and then make visible why this program, even, best case scenario, it's successful, and those who qualify can get through it. But the more likely scenario is that it's still going to be small, and there's a much larger narrative that it's a challenge if there's going to be the appropriate response to the refugee dimension.
So I just want to second that. It's really important that we capture the information and the type of case that would be eligible if they could get an interview, but isn't eligible simply because of this very strict definition of who can file. That can become a talking point for expansion of, this is a new group you have to include in this process. We have to see some success in the process, but we also have to identify other groups and really keep saying this isn't enough, this isn't enough.
Hi, I was wondering, has there been an effort made to count the number of people that have been referred or who have tried to obtain the service but have been unable to due to capacity issues at refugee resettlement agencies? Is that a number that's available or being counted at all?
It's not a number available at this point. It would be a good one for you, particularly if you're seeing your client as being given an interview 3 years from now. That's really an issue that we can use again in advocacy for making sure that there is capacity to file the cases that need to be filed.
Okay, but on the refugee resettlement side, it's not a number that could be tracked, because we sometimes make a referral and then we don't keep track of it either. So, it's because I think eventually the number would be, in our area at least, because the capacity is just not large enough to take on the number of cases that would be around.
So that's something, again, if we can build a tracking system and work with your office on the local level, that would be great to have, because it can clearly demonstrate the need to increase capacity.
Right.
Anything else? Okay.
Just another group that I think that is getting cut out, and I haven't heard much discussion of, is parents and other family members of UACs who are granted asylum here in the U.S. Just the other day, I had a child granted asylum by the asylum office, which is wonderful, but she's in an unstable living situation here in the United States, and her mother, who is a police officer in El Salvador, is at great, is facing great danger right now, and there's no way for that mother to lawfully join her daughter.
Yes, that's a very big issue, and something that, again, there isn't if that child had a child in the country, we could attach the mother onto it, but that isn't normally the situation.
I just wanted to mention one more thing, because I don't think it was mentioned, and it's not the solution to that problem, but you may have noted that people who granted refugee status or asylum in the U.S. are not eligible to file for this in-country program. However, there is another vein of the U.S. refugee admissions program, a mere shadow of its former self, but the family reunification program, whereby people who've been granted asylum in the U.S. or who've come through as refugees can file a document similar to the DS 7699, another DS form, a DS 7656, to reunite with their unmarried children under 21, spouses and or parents overseas. Now, the other hitch with that one is that in that case, in the family reunification program, the qualified refugee applicant overseas has to be outside of their country of origin. So unlike the in-country processing program, if you have an asylee or a refugee here in the U.S. who has a parent who's not here with them, wants to bring them, they can't be back in El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras. They have to be in a third country, essentially.
There is, of course, the I-730 process.
There is the I-730 process, but again, that doesn't extend to parents, as you know. But these are all people who are falling through the cracks in one way or another.
Absolutely. So I think that we've had some really good discussion. We can move on to the protection questions, which are huge, and keep this conversation going, hopefully, for further thought.